Good day everyone, Juxtaposition here. Today's video I'm going to focus as a hub on former Director of Central Intelligence Agency William Casey. You do know that I've done dozens of hours on William Colby, who was a director of CIA for a short time, 2.5 years approximately, after the Watergate scandal rocked Richard Nixon, and the public lost confidence in Richard Helms, who had lied to the Senate subcommittee on the investigation of Watergate. Richard Helms had to be moved aside to become the ambassador and deputy director of the State Department in Tehran, Iran, about 1.5 years before the Iranian kidnapping occurred, of the CIA employees that work at the State Department, and then moved across the street to a nice hotel where they could remain hostages for 444 days. I believe that was set up by Richard Helms, the former CIA director. Anyway, be that as it may, it's very confusing when there's so many Williams in the story. And as in this story, there's William Casey, there's William Colby, and then there's John Mitchell. You all remember John Mitchell from Watergate. He was the Attorney General, the United States leading criminal prosecutor, the head of law and order for the United States, John Mitchell. John Newton Mitchell, who attended Fordham University, Jesuit Catholic University there in the Bronx. John Mitchell and William Joseph Casey are like carbon copies in terms of their biography. Both attended Fordham University, Jesuit. Both were born within 6 months of each other. Both worked for the CIA. Both worked for big law firms in New York City. Both had a financial engineering background. Both died early. In the case of William Joseph Casey, paradoxically, he had 2 strokes the day before he was to testify in front of Congress regarding the Contra, drugs for arms, arms for drugs, hostage crisis, known by the Iranian Contra affair label that the media put on there. William Casey was scheduled to testify on December 15th, 1986. He was called and summoned to testify regarding arms for hostages and cocaine sales. And the day before he was to testify, he suffered 2 seizures, had a stroke, and needed to be hospitalized. So he didn't testify. And while he was recuperating from his stroke, Congress went forward with Richard Secord. You may remember the whole cast of clowns. It reminds me of Bring in the Clowns, where a little sports car drives up onto the screen, and then about 24 clowns climb out of this little tiny sports car. That's what the Iranian Contra affair was. It was a clown show. That's what Watergate was. Watergate was a clown show. That's what COVID is. It's a clown show. That's what the Ukrainian war is. It's a clown show. That's what the Vietnam War was for 10 years of Walter Cronkite. It's a clown show. Wasn't funny. It was an unfunny clown show. Some clown shows are amusing and some aren't. I found Watergate kind of hilarious, and I found the Vietnam War pathetic and outrageous and evil. All those lies, all those mendacities. Anyway, that's what you're dealing with in the meta-universe. You're dealing with a scripted, Hollywood-presented, produced and directed, bank-funded. The banks are the anthropologists. They're the social engineers. They're trying to work, as Sean Stone says, both sides against the middle to herd those sheeps to where they want the sheeps to go. And I think we all know that is to digital passport, central bank digital currency. In other words, GPS-tracked credit, social credit scores. So that you won't need debit cards, you won't need credit cards, you really won't receive a bank account anymore. bank account statements don't need to be mailed to you, because you just look at your cell phone and they'll give you your digital score. You know, and if you've been misbehaving like me, that'll be a 0. That'll be a 0.0 credit score, which means I can't buy groceries. It means I won't be able to put gas in my car. And so therefore I'm sort of in a problem situation. I could be allowed into a FEMA camp, I'm sure, where they could feed me 3 meals a day on a tray with the concertina wire and a secured perimeter, where I would be incarcerated in a re-education camp. Except I think we all know it's too late for me to be re-educated. I was already educated once, indoctrinated once, and it didn't stick. Okay, so I don't think they're going to waste time with me on a second round. I think they'll just, I will go the way of William Casey, because within 24 hours of Richard Secord testifying about what he knew or didn't remember about the Arms for Hostages Iran-Contra affair, William Casey went bye-bye. He died. Dead as a doornail. And that was on May 6th, 1987. William Casey died at age 74. His cohort, John Mitchell, he died at age 75. He died on November 9th, 1988, at age 75. Right? Remember Timothy Leary, the tune-in, turn-on, drop-out LSD maven from West Point Academy, United States Army. Timothy Leary, psychologist, got a PhD from UC Berkeley. Right? Worked for Abigail Folger's mother, Enos Mejia, in Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco. Had a house below the Sharon Tate murder scene where Oliver Silverstein Stone visited him in Benedict Canyon at 10106 Sunbrook Drive. Google it. I double dare you. Google 10106 Sunbrook Drive and then look up the hill and you'll see this monstrosity of a home that covered the Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, bayonet NATO murder scene. It's about 35 seconds up the hill, okay? If you were in a wheelchair, you could get up to where Abigail Folger's body bled out from where Oliver Stone parked his car on that cul-de-sac known as Sunbrook Drive. You could get up that hill in a wheelchair. Now, it would be challenging in a wheelchair, but it could be done. I mean, if somebody dragged you, you need some help. But you could walk up that thing in 45 seconds or less without spraining an ankle. It is a steep hill. It is a steep hill. And I'm kind of joking around about the ice plant. It's mostly weeds and some shrubbery. And check out the swimming pools on both sides, because the houses that flank the pool house above, they also have swimming pools also. So there's a lot of swimming pools in that zip code. 90210. The Timothy Leary home did not have a swimming pool and does not have a swimming pool because it's on the edge of a cliff. All right, so you realize that John Mitchell, got himself into a pickle or was deselected from service. So he died, at age 75 after his scandalous Watergate convictions, I believe for perjury and other crimes. And we had the similar situation with William Casey, who was not convicted of any crimes, but probably was going to be. And he's the director of CIA, and he has 2 strokes, and he goes bye-bye within 6 months. And so end of story for William Casey. So that's kind of my abbreviated version of what I'm going to talk about. But when you look into and delve into William Casey, who served as the director of CIA for a term of, I believe, 6 years, from 1981, when Ronald Reagan took office as president in January 1981, William Joseph Casey became the CIA director at the same time that Ronald Reagan became the fake president of the United States. And he maintained that position until 1987, where, as you know, he died from his stroke, brain tumor. He had a brain tumor, right? Right. Needed a lot of medical attention. So that's 6 years as DCI, Director of Central Intelligence. 6 years. That's twice as long as William Colby was. All right? And during Ronald Reagan's presidency, we had a hoax assassination, pneumatic dart shot at Ronald Reagan, and some other people shot with pistols, and they blamed it on John Hinckley did it, and Jodie Foster, who went to Yale, that she was the motive for John Hinckley to shoot a bunch of people when Ronald Reagan came out of the hotel. And Ronald Reagan didn't die. And as Ronald Reagan is recovering from his dart, pneumatic air gun attack, his best man from his second marriage, to Nancy Davis, not her real name. I think her name is Janice. Anyway, Ronald Reagan is recovering. He's feeling better. And then his best man from his marriage to Nancy is conked on the head with a baseball bat or a tire iron and is killed in his pristine, immaculate apartment in Santa Monica across from the beach. William Holden was killed, on or about November 16th or 17th or 18th of 1981. Okay, that's the year that Ronald Reagan became president of the United States. William Holden was murdered within 9 months of Ronald Reagan taking the oath of office. Right? 9 to 10 months. And then Natalie Wood, don't forget her, she's murdered at age 43, 1 week later. We don't have an exact date of when William Holden was murdered because he was dead as a doornail on his hardwood floor, bleeding out, with no pajama bottoms, and for at least 3 days. And he's dating a much younger, 28-year younger woman, Stephanie Powers, who's a Polish Jewish girl who changed her name to Powers. Stephanie Powers. And she brags about how she always calls her boyfriend, William Holden, every day, except for those 3 days that her boyfriend laid on the floor of his apartment, dead as a doornail. Best friends with Ronald Reagan. Best friends of Ronald Reagan. Anyway, if you follow this William Casey story with me, and you see who orbits in the sphere of the director of CIA, you will see lots and lots of suicides and medical attention and psychologists and sanitariums and people dying in their age 40s. So a lot of people get whacked in these stories. Even 15-year-old little girls get whacked. That's in this William Casey story. I got a 15-year-old little girl who lived in the Vatican City, okay, with Paul Marcinkus. Well, he had an apartment in the Vatican City and outside the walls in the city of Rome. And little Emanuelle Orlandi would go outside the walls for her flute lessons, where she went missing at age 15, never to be seen again. Paul Marcinkus, President Archbishop Paul Marcinkus from Cicero, Illinois, where Al Capone's from, where Jose Menendez had a job as the controller of an intermodal transportation container company and became the CEO in his 20s of a container shipping company. You could have drugs in there, you could have armed weapons, you could have human trafficking going on with containers. Who knows what's in those things, right? 20-foot, 40-foot containers. That was Jose Menendez before he got into the porn business. He was in the transportation containerization business out of Cicero, Illinois, where Paul Marcinkus came from to become the president of the Bank of Vatican, who was a personal friend with William Casey, director of CIA under Ronald Reagan. That's why I bring up these names, because these people all know each other. Every name I mention knows another person in the story whose name I've mentioned. All right? Now, as a spoiler alert, I got 4 Jewish people in this story too, so I'm going to tell you up front. Let's do a little test on my acumen of my listeners. You all know, right, who Eugene Isaac Meyer is, right? He was born in Los Angeles, raised in San Francisco, attended UC Berkeley, right? He bought the Washington Post newspaper in 1933 when it was in bankruptcy, yet he paid $875,000 for it, which is a lot of money. But he was a banker, so it's not a problem to get money because it's not his money. He used the bank's money to buy a social engineering newspaper, which we all know is the Washington Post. And then, oh yeah, you know, Jeff Bezos bought it. By the way, that's not his real name. Jeff Bezos' real name is Jorgensen. Jeff Bezos' biological father is Ted Jorgensen, who owned a bicycle store in New Mexico. Ted Jorgensen. Bezos is Miguel Bezos from Santiago, Cuba. That's right. And he escaped Fidel Castro's communism to then marry a very young Jeff Bezos' mother. Jeff Bezos' mother, I think, was 16 years old when she got pregnant, and her father was a big shot for the Department of Energy. And we covered the Department of Energy pretty thoroughly in my previous videos, where we have the linear accelerator installed at Stanford University and supervised by the Department of Physics, who's Jewish, whose daughter is the CEO of YouTube, and another daughter is a cloning company, 23andMe, Anne Walensky and Susan Walensky, and they're all associated with Google and the founders of Google. So they're jillionaires because of the Google stock they all have, which was financed by a Jewish banker by the name of Eugene Kleiner of Kleiner Perkins. Anyway, something like that happened, you know, 60, 70 years earlier with Eugene Isaac Meyer, who was the president of the Federal Reserve and became the president of the World Bank there in Washington, D.C. in the swamp. And then his daughter married Phil Gramm, an attorney from New York, and Phil Gramm became the publisher head of Washington Post when Eugene went over to be the CEO of the World Bank. And then everything was going okay, but then Phil Gramm had an affair with a journalist, and we're going to get back to that. We're going to circle back to Philip Gramm's affair with Robin Webb, who was a journalist, and what happened to Philip Gramm within 1 year of that affair. All right, so then our second Jewish person is Henry Kissinger. He went to Harvard. And of course, Henry Kissinger is not his real name. His real name is Heinz Alfred Meyer-Loeb. So he has the same name as Eugene Isaac Meyer. Henry Kissinger was born in Bavaria, Fürth, Bavaria, Germany, May 27, 1923. And he's in the story because, as you know, he was involved with the Nixon administration, the Gerald Ford administration, and then he's ever present during the Reagan administration. He was a national security advisor. He was Secretary of State. He was kind of a big shot there in the swamp. Henry Kissinger. He certainly knows Barbara Walters, doesn't he? Anyway, Henry Kissinger is 99 years old, just for those people that think he's 100. He's not 100. He's going to be 100 on May 27th in 2023. Henry Kissinger will be 100 years old. He's 99. So he's 10 years older than Diane Goldman Feinstein is. And Henry Kissinger's family, their name was Meyer-Loeb, but they grew up in a town that was a spa town in Bavaria known as Kissinger Spa. So he took the name of his town, Spa Town. So we went from Meyer-Loeb to Kissinger. Now that is exactly the theme in The Godfather Part 1 and 2, where we had Don Vito Corleone, right? Was one of the leaders of the 5 crime families of New York, right? Don Vito Corleone, who took the name of his village in Sicily, Corleone, right? Because what was Don Vito Corleone's true name? It was Vito Andolini. Andolini. He's Sicilian. Andolini. Vito Andolini fled after his family was murdered, his mother and his brother were murdered by, a gangster in Sicily. So he flees to New York City, to Ellis Island, where he is renamed at Ellis Island. When asked his name, he utters the word of his village, Corleone. So he becomes Vito Corleone. That's what Henry Kissinger did. Don't you? That's kind of funny. It's a funny story. That Henry Kissinger is Heinz Alfred Meyer Loeb, and he's Jewish from Bavaria. I think that's code for Alsatia. All right, well, anyway, then my third Jewish person that I have is Elliot Abrams, who's the cousin of Dan Abrams, who's a television journalist, podcaster, O.J. Simpson expert, and Dan Abrams is the older brother of Ronnie Abrams, who's a federal judge in the district court in New York, who just stepped down from the FTX Sam Bankman-Fried story, which is another Jewish story. That was financed by Doug Leone and Sequoia Capital, if you don't know, at 2800 Sand Hill Road. So Elliot Abrams, who's an odious person, just odious, and he's Jewish, and he went to Harvard, of course, and his cousin Dan went to, I forget where Dan went to. His cousin Ronnie went to Yale, and Elliot Abrams went to Harvard, like Henry Kissinger did. And Dan Abrams, oh man, forget where he went, but his father went to Columbia and to Yale. And our fourth Jewish person that's in this story is Caspar Weinberger, who was the executive vice president, chief counsel for the Bechtel Construction Company. It's a private family company. He's a member of the Bohemian Club, and he was the Secretary of Defense for Ronald Reagan during the Iran-Contra scandal. Caspar Weinberger, and who went to Harvard and grew up in San Francisco, Jewish. And his cohort, George Shultz, born in New York, but died at the Stanford University campus in California, the Hoover Institute fellow. George Shultz was the president and CEO of the Bechtel Construction Company when Caspar Weinberger was executive vice president, general counselor, top lawyer. And Caspar Weinberger became Secretary of Defense for Ronald Reagan, and of course we all know that George Shultz became Secretary of State, which is CIA housing director worldwide, provides offices for all CIA agents worldwide. George Shultz. And they were opposed to the Iranian-Contra arms for hostage financial transaction involving drugs, cocaine, which we don't really talk about. So those are the four Jewish people. Eugene Meyer, who bought the Washington Post that brought us the Watergate scandal. Henry Kissinger, who was all over the Watergate scandal. Elliot Abrams, who's all over the Iran-Contra scandal and lied to Congress and had to plead guilty and was convicted of perjury, although if you Wikipedia it, they say lying to Congress. That's perjury. It's perjury. And it's a felony. Richard Helms also pled guilty to perjury, but somehow they made it a misdemeanor. Anyway, Elliot Abrams, Jewish, pled guilty to lying to Congress, which I'm calling perjury. And Caspar Weinberger was not convicted of perjury, but he's a Jewish man who was the Secretary of Defense when we had weapons being transported to Iran so they could fight the Iraqis. It's just a CIA operation. And they come with this cockamamie story about what they were going to do anyway. They don't need any of the drug money. They don't need any money from drugs at all. They normally import drugs into the United States, and they normally send weapons to places in the world that they want to kill people, like Vietnam, for example. I wouldn't be surprised if we find out that the CIA is the #1 purchaser of AK-47s for the so-called Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese Army, which I think they have uniforms. You know, the Viet Cong don't wear uniforms because they're just sort of infiltrated into all 47 provinces of Indonesia, French Indonesia. Anyway, so we have Eugene Meyer, Henry Kissinger, Elliot Abrams, and Caspar Weinberger, and they orbit in my story regarding William Casey. And during the time that he was the director of CIA, which again was 1981 until 1987, he flew to Rome a lot, and he visited with the Pope, where he updated the Pope on world affairs, if you can believe that. You had the CIA director being snuck into the Vatican City because nobody wanted you to know that the director of CIA was an active visitor of the Vatican City. And that was all going on when Paul Marcinkus was the president of the Bank of Vatican. He was the president of the Bank of Vatican for 18 years, from 1971 until 1989. Paul Marcinkus is an American. He's an archbishop in the Catholic Church. He is the president of the Bank of Vatican, which goes by the acronym IOR, Institute of Religious Studies, and he was raised in Cicero, Chicago, Illinois. Paul Marcinkus. And while William Casey is visiting the Vatican City from 1981 until 1987, till he had his stroke, I would say it was 1981 through 1986. Because remember, he had his stroke around December 14th, 1986. And then he didn't really travel anymore. So, you got a 5-year period where William Casey was visiting the Holy See and visiting Paul Marcinkus and the Pope. The replacement Pope for John Paul I, who was handed a cup of tea laced with cyanide, I believe, in September 1978. That's before William Casey was CIA director. But anyway, after that, he's visiting Paul Marcinkus and the Pope, and Emanuela Orlandi, age 15, goes off for her flute lessons. She's living in the Holy City, and she never returns. Ever. I mean, never again. Because I believe she was murdered. And Paul Marcinkus was later accused of having something to do with her murder. And then he countered with, he tried to raise money for her ransom. But then, if you put 2 and 2 together, I think it's more of paying the killers to kill little Emanuela Orlandi, who probably knew too much, right? Her father worked for the Bank of Vatican in the Holy City. And his 15-year-old daughter was disappeared. Kind of in the way that Anne Heche was. Kind of in the way that Tom Hanks is. Kind of in the way of Jeffrey Epstein. Is he dead or alive? I don't know. Is Ghislaine Maxwell alive? I haven't spoken to her personally. I don't know. I haven't visited her. Where's Emanuela Orlandi? Why don't we ask William Casey? And since he's not available, we'll have to ask the current CI director. I'll bet that he knows. I'll bet he knows. So, people go missing a lot. And you shouldn't be surprised when people like Sharon Tate get murdered or JonBenét Ramsey get asphyxiated. It happens all the time. JonBenét Ramsey's father worked for Lockheed as an executive vice president. That's CIA. She's a daughter of a CIA officer. Sharon Tate was the daughter of an Army intelligence officer, Colonel Paul Tate, who lived next door to Nancy and Paul Pelosi in Presidio Heights, San Francisco. Why are you surprised? He was part of Operation Gladio, by the sword, which a bayonet is a sword, or bayonets, plural, because we're talking about a dozen bayonets. And nobody ever goes into war with one bayonet. They didn't have one bayonet at My Lai. They had 100 or 90 bayonets. All right, so William Casey visited the Vatican, and he was visiting when Paul Marcinkus was the head of the Vatican Bank, which is really the only reason the CIA would have anything to do with the Vatican. They don't care about the Pope. The Pope's not, making money laundering decisions. But Paul Marcinkus and Roberto Calfi and Michele Sedona are, so you definitely want to meet with those guys. And they were all around until Roberto Calfi, of course, was murdered in June 1982. So I'm sure that William Casey knew Roberto Calfi, and I'm sure he knew Michele Sedona. But those two guys were killed in 1982 and 1986. when William Casey was CIA director. And Emmanuel Orlandi went missing in 1983, right after Roberto Calfi was murdered. And the exact date on when she went missing is, I've got that here somewhere. No, it was 1983. I'm not sure what month it was. Yeah, I got it right here. It was June 22nd, 1983. Emmanuel Orlandi went to flute lessons. She took her flute lessons, and then she was going to get on a bus and come back to the Vatican City, and she never returned. She's 15 years old, went missing in Rome, outside the Vatican City, on June 22nd, 1983, which is approximately 1 year after Roberto Calfi was hung by an orange rope with a love knot under the Blackfriar Bridge, Masonic architecture, Argentinian flag colors, facing the central bankers of the world in central London, with 13 pounds of cement bricks in his Italian suit pockets. Then Emmanuel Orlandi, age 15, little girl, disappeared, murdered, disappeared in 1983. All right? So, the arms for hostages scandal is what William Casey is best, known for, because he was the CIA director when all this nefarious activity is going on, which I'm telling you, it's going on today. They just don't, the media doesn't report it, and it's not labeled, like Iran-Contra. That's a fake name for something that they do routinely anyway. There's nothing new about that. Ronald Reagan didn't cook that idea up. He didn't cook that idea up. The characters in that story, Richard Secord, Oliver North, United States Marines, Elliot Abrams, Robert Bud McFarland, who's a national security advisor, along with, who else we got in there? Admiral John Poindexter, United States Navy. He's a national security advisor. He's in the Iran-Contra drugs for hostages story. Senator John Tower, who had the committee to look into Iran-Contra, he's in on the deal too. Then you got, on the sidelines, you got George Shultz, who graduated from Princeton and taught at MIT Sloan Business School. And I believe he has a degree from MIT, just like Doug Leone does, just like Sam Bankman-Fried does. Fried who's not freed, he's fried. Caspar Weinberger, who went to Harvard, like Daniel Ellison, another Jewish person I'm not going to talk about. Daniel Ellsberg of Rand Corporation went to Harvard, got an undergraduate degree and a master's degree from Harvard. Daniel Ellsberg, to go along with Seymour Hersh, another Jewish person from Chicago. Daniel Ellsberg, a Jewish person from Chicago. They're going to tell you what to believe about the Vietnam War. Are you crazy? You don't believe anything that Seymour Hersh says. You don't believe anything that Daniel Ellsberg says. They are social engineering, applied linguistics, crisis actors. They're not journalists. They're not analysts. They're media-presented whistleblower, fake whistleblowers. That's what they are. They're fake. The only information that comes out of their pie hole is typed up at the CIA, Langley, Virginia, okay? All right, so you see that Ronald Reagan or Joe Biden or Donald Trump, they're just surrounded by jackals. So it doesn't make any difference if your name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy and you happen to, want to make some changes, or if you just go with the flow like Ronald Reagan did, and you have an 8-year presidency without getting killed, or if you go with the dementia medication like Joe Biden's going with. I mean, you just go along for the ride. You go along for the ride, you won't get killed. Or if you're a cackling cacophony of chaos, you can be Kamala Harris. The sugar baby for Willie Brown. Kamala Harris. Okay, this is what I really want to tell you. This is very important. I'm going to wrap it up on this. So, Eugene Isaac Meyer, president of the Federal Reserve Bank, he gets unlimited credit. He purchases the Washington Post out of bankruptcy, and then he doesn't know anything about social engineering. He's competing with William Randolph Hearst for control of the Washington Post, and a decision is made to, let the Jewish guy run it. So, Eugene Isaac Meyer becomes the chairman of the board of Washington Post. His daughter, Catherine Meyer, she marries this Philip Graham, who was born, I believe, in Los Angeles and ended up in a New York law firm. And so they get married, and then he leaves the law firm to become the editor-publisher, the publisher for the Washington Post, where Ben Bradlee becomes the editor. Ben Bradlee of Navy Intelligence, and then of course, he hires a guy with zero journalist experience, Bob Woodward, which is Navy Intelligence. Bob Woodward, no journalism experience whatsoever. Carl Bernstein did have journalist experience. He's the Jewish reporter that's paired with Bob Woodward. And they cracked the Watergate case, using Deep Throat, which Deep Throat is code for CIA gives me my storylines and then I put my name on it. That's Deep Throat. There is no Deep Throat. Deep Throat is CIA, okay? There is no person named Deep Throat. That was a nice red herring to throw you off. And the guy in Santa Rosa, he's not Deep Throat. The guy, number 3 guy at FBI. The FBI knows nothing. The CIA owns the FBI. You don't need to get a whistleblower at the FBI, okay? And we've learned from my stories, if you whistleblow, that means you don't follow orders, you get whacked. So nobody is blowing any whistles in these stories, okay? They're fake whistleblowers. So Eugene Meyer employs his son-in-law, Philip Graham. And I guess then Philip Graham takes on more responsibility when Eugene goes over to be CEO of the World Bank. And then a transaction is made to transfer ownership from Eugene to his daughter and son-in-law. And allegedly he gives a gift of 30% of the company to Catherine Graham, and 70% on a purchase. He sells 70% to Philip Graham. He finances a purchase of 70% of the company. So in other words, Philip Graham doesn't use any of his own money, but he is bestowed 70% control of the company while Eugene is still the chairman of the board. So I'm not really sure how the power structure works over there. I mean, here's the way it really works. The CIA runs the Washington Post, not Philip Graham and not Eugene Meyer and not Catherine Graham. They are not in charge. The CIA is in charge. Anyway, so Philip Graham runs into this Robin Webb, who he falls madly in love with in 1962. They have a storming affair. He leaves his wife, Catherine. Now, Eugene has passed away in 1959, so he is not aware of this. He's dead. He's dead, and he has this agreement of his estate to sell 70% of the company to his son-in-law. So this affair is not made aware to Eugene Meyer because he died. And he died at age 80, I believe he was 84 years old when he passed away. And so he doesn't know about it, but his daughter does. She's pretty upset about this Robin Webb affair, right? So anyway, they have this passionate affair. It goes on for, 9 months or so. And then, of course, you still have to go to work and you do your thing. So there's a strained relationship now because Philip Graham has separated from Catherine Graham, his wife. And they end up over in Arizona and they're giving a speech. And Philip Graham is giving a speech. And then he misspoke and he says that he knows who killed Mary Pichot Meyer, another Meyer, who was married to Cord Meyer, who is very high up in the CIA. Very high up officer in CIA. I think he's like the number 3 person, under Allen Dulles at the time. He was number 3 under Allen Dulles, brother of John Foster Dulles, who all went to Princeton. Anyway, so Cord Meyer divorced Mary Pichot Meyer, who's having an affair with John Kennedy over decades. They were lovers for at least 20 years. Since John Kennedy was in his mid-20s until his death, where he was 46 years old when they blew his head off, right? So anyway, Philip Meyer blurts out something about the Mary Pichot Meyer murder in Georgetown, the swamp. And then He is considered to be having a manic episode like Aaron Valente. He's considered to be bipolar. He's put in a straitjacket. He's sedated. He's put on a windowless airplane and flown back to Washington, where he's put into a sanitarium. He's 46 years old. He is given lots of drugs. Oh, he's 47, 48 years old. He then pleads to be released. Eventually, after seeing a psychologist and receiving probably electroshock treatments, he's released to an estate property in Virginia, which is code for CIA property, whereupon he kills himself with a shotgun at age 48. So Philip Graham blows his head off exactly like George DeMornshield did in Palm Beach, Florida, at a CIA estate home there. You know, the big hedgerow off of 1A1. Well, it's off the street off 1A1 highway. 9 miles south of the Breakers Hotel, George DeMornshield blew his brains out with his daughter out shopping in a home that he didn't live in. I mean, he's staying there. And blows his head off with a shotgun. You'd have to use your toe because the shotgun's 47 inches long. You could never reach the trigger with your thumb and blow your head off. You have to use your toe. And the problem is these knuckleheads had their shoes on. So I don't know how you shoot yourself with a shotgun when you can't possibly pull the trigger with your shoe on. And that's the situation with Philip Graham, which occurred in 1963, just before John Kennedy had his blown off. This happened on August 3rd, 1963. John Kennedy was murdered on November 22nd, 1963. 3 months after Philip Graham went bye-bye. So then Katharine Graham took over as publisher for the Washington Post. And then, later we had Jeff Bezos, not his real name. And I think we're on to someone else now, right? It's a social engineering platform. It's got nothing to do with news reporting whatsoever. Bob Woodward is a joke. Carl Bernstein is a bad joke. Bob Woodward is funny. Carl Bernstein is not funny. I would have loved to hear Philip Graham, go on about Mary Pichot Meyer. It's something I'm very interested in. She was killed on a canal trail by a professional murderer. I think she was shot like 5 times, something like that. They made damn sure she was shot. She fell down. Then they gave her the coup de grace. There's no way she's going to survive. Beautiful woman, and murdered in Georgetown, where they have no homicides ever except CIA homicides. All right, so I thought you'd get a kick out of the fact that that William Casey is kind of like a hub, and then orbiting around him are all these Jewish people, bankers, fake editors, fake publishers, Holy See, Catholic, right? Emmanuel Orlandi going bye-bye, missing. Roberto Calfi being murdered when William Casey was CI director. Michele Sedona, who's the banker for the 5 crime families of New York, he's murdered with a cappuccino laced with cyanide. Exactly how John Paul I, Pope, was murdered. Cup of tea laced with cyanide. Perhaps how Aaron Valente was murdered at 2500 Sand Hill Road. Perhaps someone offered her a cup of tea. She was visiting a Jewish banker who graduated from Harvard University, had an MBA from Stanford. He's Jewish, and he works for a Jewish venture capital company called KKR, which is Jerome Kohlberg, Henry Kravis, George Roberts. All 3 Jewish men, founders from Bear Stearns, New York. And Aaron Valente was meeting with one of their minions, who's a managing director of a unit of KKR, and then she gets kind of goofy and ends up having a manic episode and dead as a doornail, where she uttered the words that I'll end this video on. It's all a game. It's a thought experiment. We're in the Matrix. Now, you can understand that Aaron Valente was correct, can't you? When the newspapers are fake, whether it's Eugene Meyer or William Randolph Hearst, not Jewish, who owns all these newspapers, or it's Ted Turner, who was Jane Fonda's 3rd husband, right? Jane Fonda's third husband. Every person that Jane Fonda married was a social engineer crisis actor. Her first husband had 2 wives before Jane Fonda. He married Brigitte Bardot first. He was a Hollywood screenwriter. He worked with Sarah Bernhardt. Okay? You know that his name was Roger Vadim, which is short for Vlamindikov. That's why they call him Vladim, because no one can pronounce his name. That was Jane Fonda's first husband, his third wife. Then she marries Tom Hayden, who's Catholic, but then claims in childhood at a parochial school that his Catholic priest preached anti-Semite teaching, so he lost his Catholicism beliefs because his teacher said negative things about Jewish people. What a poppycockster. That's ridiculous. And then she marries Ted Turner, who's basically an aggregator. He doesn't create content, but he goes around and consolidates things like Amazon does. Remember, Amazon started out selling books, and then now it owns, MGM Resorts and Sony Pictures and TriStar, and Oliver Stone's JFK is owned by Amazon. And then you have, they got into Whole Foods grocery stores. So what does that have to do with selling books on the internet? It has nothing. It has to do with pacification and control and destruction of small businesses. That's the purpose of Amazon, right? And that was the purpose of Ted Turner, because now we have the Communist News Network, which we wouldn't have had without Ted Turner, Jane Fonda's third husband, who she divorced. Jane Fonda's been divorced 3 times. Her father, Henry Fonda, was married 5 times, divorced 3, died married. Anyway, it's all a game. It's a thought experiment. We're in the Matrix. Aaron Valente, you died at age 33, Masonic number 33. You were right. And I'm very suspicious about 2500 Sand Hill Road, directly across the street from the Linear Accelerator, Department of Energy, which pays Stanford University hundreds of millions of dollars for what we don't know. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.